Okay, good morning, everyone. And thank you for those of you who've joined this live stream today from the Lincoln International Business School. This event is streaming live simultaneously across Facebook, LinkedIn, and our YouTube channels. Today, we're hosting episode 3 of the series entitled Business Beyond the Curve. This forms an integral part of Resilient Lincolnshire, which is conceptualised in partnership with the Centre for Resilience. Business Beyond the Curve is a set of conversations with key figures and voices in and across Greater Lincolnshire. And I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Charbel, for today's presentation. Charbel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gary. So, welcome to the webinar, Sustainability of Supply Chains in the Wake of COVID-19. My name is Charbel, and with my colleagues, Gary, Martin, Eliseo, Beatriz, and David, we are part of the University of Lincoln community of experts in sustainability, supply chains, and logistics. And it's great to have you online today with us. This webinar is organized into 2 parts. The first one, this presentation, concerns challenges and trends in supply chain management triggered by COVID-19. In the second part of the panel, we will have the pleasure of addressing your questions. We will do our best to address as many of your questions as possible. So please send your questions during this presentation. And the main topic here is, why is COVID-19 affecting modern supply chains? And the answer is that COVID-19 is a supply chain risk which can be classified as unknown unknowns in supply chain risk assessment. This kind of risk is impossible to precisely predict, but can do major damage. COVID-19 is thus part of the so-called black swans events in supply chain risk assessment. And as you can see here, in the World Uncertainty Index, COVID-19 is generating a never-seen-before perception of global uncertainty. And of course, this uncertainty is affecting the 2020 economic growth projections. As you can see, for 2020, the majority of economies will be negative. And this economic growth projection gets better in 2021. But the uncertainty created by COVID-19 is not only affecting the economic growth of nations, it's also disrupting the global supply chains of the majority of the companies. As you can see here, the large majority of well-designed supply chains of Fortune 1000 companies have been disrupted. So COVID-19 is creating uncertainty around the globe, and this creates disruption in supply chains. What are the concepts to understand the current weaknesses of our supply chains? So we need to know that a supply chain can be represented as in this figure, where you have materials flowing from suppliers to manufacturers, to wholesalers and warehouses, to retailers, until they reach final consumers. So supply chain management is in charge of coordinating the movement of goods and data from suppliers to final customers. And supply chains can be classified as domestic supply chains, when the flow of these materials and information happens within the same country, or global and modern supply chains, when a company buys or uses goods or services from overseas in a dynamic worldwide network. And of course, modern global supply chains tend to be much more affected by COVID-19 than domestic supply chains. And why? It's because modern supply chains have some characteristics, such as they rely on international trade and logistics. They have lean inventories. They have multi-tiered supply chains, which means they have suppliers of suppliers of suppliers, which makes things difficult to coordinate. They are designed to keep inventory and the labor cost at a minimum, and access to key suppliers and key markets. These modern supply chains might develop a cost-cut obsession, and all these characteristics can lead to a systemic weaknesses in these global supply chains. So you can see in this graph that over the decades, companies have been very good at reducing their internal risks by cutting inventory and costs, but they have increased their external risks by going global, and that they have become more vulnerable to disruptions. And when disruptions in supply chains happen, they damage the ability of an organization to deliver its mission. Disruptions in supply chains can affect, for example, business goals in terms of productivity, profitability, revenue targets, shareholder obligations, and the customers' complaints. Disruption in supply chains can also affect social and environmental issues, which means the sustainability of the supply chain, by damaging the safety and well-being of the workforce, the generation of jobs, payment of taxes, fair treatment of suppliers, and capacity of the supply chain to run waste management and recycling initiatives. Supply chain disruptions can also affect customer satisfaction in terms of availability of products and services, quality of products, health and safety, fair prices, and consumers' rights. In this figure, you have a representation of the global supply chain of pasta consumed in the UK, with items from Canada moving to Italy, and when pasta is ready, produced, it's moved to the UK. And COVID-19 has, for example, disrupted the supply chain in many ways. For example, it's generating panic buying, so people start buying more pasta than what they really need. Borders can close, or drivers may not be able to drive between countries. Staff in production and distribution can get COVID-19 and be ill. And this supply chain can face a disruption at ports. So a number of potential disruptions generated by COVID-19 in this very important pasta supply chain. But how to mitigate the vulnerabilities of supply chains during COVID-19? So what managers must know about reducing the vulnerabilities of their supply chains during this pandemic? The first thing to know is that supply chain vulnerability during this pandemic tend to occur across 5 dimensions. So there are 5 potential bottlenecks that COVID-19 can affect. The first one regards to planning and supplier network. And the main question here is how predictable is demand and planning. The second bottleneck is transportation and logistics. And the main question here is how resilient is your logistics network? Financial resiliency. So how much financial flexibility and capacity does the company have to deal with disruptions in their supply chain? Because supply chain and logistics costs can go up. Product complexity. The main question here is, can we replace components of your product with others in case of disruption? And this final very important question here, how proactive is your organization? How flexible is your organization to adapt to the pandemic and to further disruptions? Is the organization more reactive or proactive? Once we understand these 5 bottlenecks that COVID-19 may attack in a company's supply chain, we can then move on and understand 6 supply chain block of actions that you can implement to really mitigate the action of COVID-19 in the supply chain and bulletproof your supply chain. In this green box, focusing on suppliers, the main action is to create transparency if you have a multi-tier supply chain. How to monitor your suppliers, how to keep in contact with your suppliers and understand their constraints. And in the bottom side, how to estimate available inventory in a precise way, how to ensure your inventory is precise. Moving on, we have plant and distribution center actions that you can take. For example, optimize production and distribution capacity, mainly by paying attention to the health and safety of your workforce. And you can also identify and secure extra logistics capacity so you can deliver your production on time. And finally, in this final block of actions focusing on customers, it will be important to assess a realistic final consumer demand by gathering as much as data as possible. And also, you will need to manage cash and network capital so your supply chain will be able to be alive even if there are major shocks. Of course, you can have a much more detailed reading about this reference after the webinar. So we have understood why COVID is creating troubles for supply chains. We discussed the challenges of global supply chains and the actions that managers can take to ensure their supply chains are resilient. But now I would like to discuss with you the main trends we might see in global supply chains post-pandemic. The first trend is that supply chains will need to deal with invisible threats. We believe very much that supply chains managers will be much more prepared to deal with the so-called invisible threats of the future: viruses, superbugs, resistant bacteria, and cybercrime as well, which can damage the economy in a significant way. Trend 2, accelerated adoption of supply chain 4.0 technologies. So we might see an increased adoption of Internet of Things, advanced robotics, big data, in order to have a faster, more accurate and flexible, more efficient and automated, and also greener supply chains. And due to COVID, there are trends which are likely to stay. For example, virtualization of business models when companies try to diversify their traditional businesses by going online, and an increase in e-commerce. Here we have evidence that the surge for new technologies is already happening. For example, supply chains are now facing an automation anxiety to adopt remote working technologies and contactless technologies. For example, contactless payment and processes tend to be huge trend. Trend 3. We might see globalized supply chains being challenged by questions such as, when is too much global a global supply chain? Is reshoring, bringing manufacturing back home, the best option? Or questions such as, do local firms fulfill the requirements to be suppliers? And the point here is that reshoring, bringing production back home, is not easy and may take years to develop suppliers at home. For example, in this just published article in Harvard Business Review, it's argued that modern products require high degrees of specialization and the unique skills. They have very particular supply chains, complex supply chains. And developing these complex products at home might take time and increase production costs. The question is, will consumers be willing to pay more for these products? And you can see here that the majority of countries rely on imports of intermediate products coming from China. So we might see globalization challenged, but we don't know how the future of global supply chains will look like. Trend 4, an increased focus on key supply chains. We will likely see more interest in key supply chains and how to protect them from further shocks, such as Brexit. I'm talking about pharmaceutical, life sciences, health devices, PPE, agri-food chains, logistics, and transports. So these are key supply chains. And we are likely to see an increased discussion on how to better recognize key workers who keep these key supply chains alive during the pandemic, during the crisis. If you consider this key supply chain, this example of the US pharmaceutical supply chain, you will find that 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients in this pharmaceutical supply chain in the US comes from overseas. 80%. And also that there are only 28% of US FDA registered facilities in the USA. So both materials, how materials, ingredients, and production is based on overseas. And thus, we may ask, how will the US policy for pharma supply chains look like after COVID? there are no easy answers. 25, we might see government intervention in these key supply chains. We might see more regulation, for example, as it's happening in the US meeting supply chain. US meat supply chain is being affected by labor shortages. And the government is really keen to make these supply chains working. Another example, we might see a partial or total nationalization of key supply chains. For example, Italy has just decided to be 100% self-sufficient for PPE. Now it's only 25%. Trend 6, an increased focus on regional supply chains with neighbors countries, triggered by regional trade deals. For example, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, in which Mexico is likely to increase its role as production hub in that area. And finally, trend 7, specific supply chains are likely to have particular challenges and opportunities. And for example, the hospitality supply chain. I'd like to highlight that the International Air Transport Association found that 40% of recent travelers anticipated waiting at least 6 months after the virus is contained before flying again. 6 months. And 69% indicated that they could delay a return to travel until they fix their personal financial situation. So we are likely to see a boost in regional and national tourism, with opportunities for the regional visitor economy, for example, in Lincolnshire. So it's important that the supply chain of the hospitality sector in this region and the regional supply chains are ready for the post-pandemic. Here you can find useful reference and more detailed information about the topics highlighted in this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and please send your questions to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charbel. Some very interesting points raised there, and have certainly generated some interest from those of you out there in the world who are listening into this. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to a question from Matthew. Thank you very much, Matthew. I'm thinking this is probably for you, Martin. Matthew's concerned about long-term geographic food supply and food security, which I know you have been involved in some research in, and he mentions the Dimbleby National Food Strategy, which suggests that more non-perishable food stocks will be needed in the future and that more local food production will be needed. Do you want to share your thoughts, Martin, please?
Yeah, I would. Thank you. First, thank you very much to Charbel for that really interesting presentation. I thought that was excellent. Yeah, really, Matthew Taylor's question in the chat, and it's quite pertinent to Lincolnshire. Matthew was suggesting that he picked this up from the Henry Dimbleby chat this morning on Radio 4, and it was suggesting that we could need to shift to more non-perishable foods, i.e. longer life foods, but also there should be a shift towards localized food production. Just on the localized side for a moment, Lincolnshire, as many of you know, produces over 20% of the UK's food requirement. So we're well set, to be in a position where we can supply an awful lot of localized products. But the only other problem is Lincolnshire is also a major hub for imported foods. So we're not going to get around the problem of needing imported foods because we don't have the climatic condition to produce oranges and tea and all the rest of it. So yes, I can see a growth in shorter localized supply chains, but it doesn't negate the fact that we'll still require international supply of foods of many products that we can't produce in the UK. But maybe some of the shorter life perishables that are produced overseas could shift to a more localized economy. So I do predict a growth in local foods, local supply chains, but we need to grow the infrastructure locally to be able to support that. Maybe, I mean, I'd like, if possible, my colleague Eliseo to come in just to talk about how we can create localized food networks. Eliseo, I wonder if you're there. It might be worth you just chipping in about localized food networks and what that means for Lincolnshire.
Yes, thank you, Martin. Martin has been talking about the supply side of this conversation. When we look at the demand side, there is also a series of elements that need to be considered, like disponibility. That's one, but there are other two. One is accessibility, and another is affordability. And that is not discussed so well in detail because in terms of accessibility, this lockdown has reduced the possibilities of people moving to buy products. So people has to go to the corner shops, but many people cannot move because they are elderly and they are in very big risk situations. So there are possibilities to change the way business run. If you are brave enough and you take the technologies and you try to move and change the way you do business, and you try to do things like delivery at home, and the way this is distributed changes massively. So in terms of the local production, we can see a big change in several places. We can see how other systems of production that are more local or city-based, like allotments, etc., may become an important line of support for the rest of the food supply. So there are many ways of going through this. I wouldn't look only in terms of disponibility, in terms of the production. I will also think about the demand side, because that provides other ways of doing business, at least in the food industry.
Eliseo, I was wondering, how do you think we can then support local businesses? For example, in Lincolnshire, how do we support local businesses and create the infrastructure, provide them with the technology to improve their local supply chain?
Well, in my personal view, what we need is to change the role of some of the main actors. Many people is against intermediaries. Many people is criticizing always intermediaries because they are things in the middle. They are hurdles, but they are also other things. They can help people to collect and to distribute. Now the question is, who are these intermediaries? As we discussed some times ago, we were investigating, Martin and I, we have been discussing about government, the role of government, the role of the chambers of commerce and these kind of organizations, the role of the NGOs. These kind of organizations, if they can develop alternative food supply chains that are short, where small producers can partner and do things together, like sharing databases or sharing marketing online, or distributing together, doing baskets. So there are many things they can do together that The only thing is that you need somebody that is able to support them in this transition. And there are many entities that are available in the government, universities, and even NGOs that can do this role. The point is these people to change a little the way they see themselves and to participate more actively in this kind of development.
I think, Elise, I think that's a very interesting point from my perspective and my work with non-governmental organisations across the globe. And you're right, I think they've got a lot to bring to the table by way of expertise in agility and flexibility. And I think the educational piece will be at both ends of the telescope, really, with local businesses realising the input that those organisations can have, and those organisations realising the impact that they can have on local economies going forward. Because I certainly think we talk a lot in the academic world and in the professional world about glocalisation, another nice academic made-up word, and I think that will be the theme of the day going forward. Thanks for that discussion, guys. I hope that addressed your question, Matthew, and by all means come back to us if you've got any more concerns. I've got one here from Colin. I think it's in your remit actually, Beatrice, with the concerns around sustainability, quite rightly pointing out that sustainability was the key topic in supply chain management before COVID. Do you still feel it's an issue, or has it been, dare I say, pushed to the back burner a little bit in this current climate?
Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the people which are participating in this interesting debate. As Csaba has highlighted in his presentation, due to disruptions in supply chains, unfortunately, some purpose of organizations such as improving environmental management can be neglected during this period of contingency. But what we hope to see is that organizations will be able to realize the importance of aligning economic and environment purpose in order to redesign supply chains, because it's very important to remember that the ultimate purpose of any supply chain is to satisfy and fulfill customers' needs. And due to COVID-19, it has been highlighted that consumers' behaviors might be changed. So, for example, I'd like to share with you an interesting survey which was conducted by Ernst Young, a consultants company. So Ernst Young conducted a survey of around 5,000 people, tracking consumer sentiment and behaviors across the US, Canada, the UK, France, and Germany. And the result of the survey was that overall, 42% of respondents believe that the way they shop will fundamentally change as a result of COVID-19 outbreak. And when it comes to brands and products, 34% of consumers indicate that they would pay more for local products, 24% for trusted brands, and 23% for ethical products. So, based on this survey from the Ernst Young, we can realize that consumers are willing to pursue a more sustainable consumption perspective. So, as a consequence, companies and their supply chains should realize the importance of maintaining sustainability as one of the purposes of the operations and the strategies.
Csaba, I don't know whether you want to add anything from your perspective to what Beatrix has just said. Some interesting discussion there about changing priorities again, I think, for the future.
Thank you very much, Gary. Indeed, companies' priorities now are related to, keep alive. They just want to survive this period. And we have seen disruption in reverse logistics and some green practices, not only in supply chains, but also in public management. Councils struggle to keep, reverse logistics and waste management on. But I very much believe that, a sustainable supply chain will bring more resilience, not only in terms of environmental management, but also on, how you manage, you recognize your workforce.
Yeah.
We have seen how key workers are suffering during this crisis, and a sustainable supply chain should consider the safety and health of key workers as #1 priority. So in this sense, I think that after COVID-19, we will really realize that our supply chains were not sustainable enough. We should invest more on this.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Charbel. David, I've got an interesting question from Amina, which I think leans towards your technology 4.0 interests and some of the stuff that Charbel mentioned earlier in the presentation. And she's talking about, should we start considering moving the majority of our work schedules remotely to be able to maintain a balance? And similarly, Craig's talking about using reshoring as a likely option for economic redevelopment. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a combination of elements that firms should be thinking about at the moment. There's no question, if you take Lincolnshire, that we are part of global networks of particularly high value production systems, and we hope that some of those skills that we have in Lincolnshire are not reshored elsewhere in the world. So I know some firms locally in Lincoln who a product may be made in China, sent to America for the first operation, brought to Lincolnshire for second operation, and then returned to America for third or fourth operation. Let's hope that our operations are not taken elsewhere. But I think that what COVID has presented to us, also based on the previous question about sustainability, is that we have to rethink a lot of our models of procurement and where things are located. There's no question about that. I've been thinking recently over in the last few hours and few days, the models that we've seen from the 1970s to the 1980s to the 1990s up to Lean now, we need to start really investigating what is the current model for the next 24 months, or what is the model that we will be operating under for the next 5 years. And Agile will be part of that, but the reshoring will definitely be part of the picture. It's this balancing act within the supply network. What are the critical components? Is the only possible source somewhere else in the world for us to be able to have that design or production of our product or manufacture of that product? Can we, and if that is the only place in the world where that operation can take place, how do we ensure that we have a resilient supply chain to enable us to be able to continue that production? If it's not the only place, can we find an alternative within our own borders or within a reasonable distance to our borders, which we feel is a sustainable and confident supply chain? How do we balance out again, perhaps a percentage of our production going to one producer and part of our procurement going to another? I think we have to really start looking. I don't have the answer to it yet, but we need to really consider what those proportions might be. Is it 50-50? Is it a 40-40-20 split? I think this is what we need to be thinking about longer term, and technology will be part of that. There's no question. We're still looking into the possibilities of blockchain. I know many people are talking about that. The answers are not completely there yet, but that could be part of the answer. But just even how we operate within the cloud and virtually is going to be a key part of what happens, not only in the next, I said, 24 months, but also beyond that. I don't know if that answers the question, but those are my immediate thoughts.
Thank you, David. Eliseo, if I perhaps bring you in, David mentioned the change in operational approaches going forward. And any thoughts from your research in that particular area and the influence of technology forward with respect to operations as opposed to just purely the supply chain?
There are several problems in the way we are operating the lines, because the discussion between trying to be as effective and efficient and lean as possible, or on the other side, try to be too agile, is a discussion that we have had for many years. What is the best thing to do? And to be fair, it depends. It depends what do you want to do. You can attack the market of efficiencies and prices, or you can attack the market of covering a particular sector. So in reality, I would argue that it is in cases like this where agility seems to be the clue. However, that doesn't work for many companies and many organizations, so it's extremely difficult to answer something like that. It will change. I wouldn't say that it will change. There are lines of production. There are products that can just not change. Producing cars or producing ships or producing planes, these kind of things cannot change. They have been done in a particular way, and they will continue being doing in that way. I think the main impact will be more in the small and medium enterprises and probably the micro, because those have discovered that there are other ways to deal with this. Many of them are moving in online delivery and other kind of ways of doing things. So we'll see. My impression is that for the big organizations, there is not too much space, apart from all this discussion about working from home, etc. It is more in the micro and in the small world where things, I think, will change massively, because technology will go in much more than at the moment. That's my view.
Thanks, Eliseo. Moving on to a question from Sarah about procurement and the impact on procurement going forward. And certainly from my perspective, I think great lessons are being learned very quickly, particularly with NHS colleagues who are, as you can probably imagine, incredibly busy at the moment with procurement activity, not just within the PPE areas, but in other areas as well that keep the NHS going on a day-to-day basis. And from what I've seen, procurement professionals are realizing that the sort of step-by-step processes, the classic procurement cycles that are out there, are all fine and good in a dare I say, a level economy. But at the moment, with the way things are going, things are moving so quickly that you simply haven't got the time to apply the classic cyclic methodologies to certain procurement activity. And I think this leans on your point about supply chain disruption, Charbel, during the presentation, and the fact that certain vulnerabilities are being exposed, particularly around quality. I'm sure colleagues have all seen recently the purchase of ventilators from China that turned out to be, dare I say, useless when they arrived in the UK. Charbel, I don't know whether you want to pick up on this discussion around vulnerability and the fact that sometimes in these dare I say, rushed times, quality becomes almost a backseat thing when perhaps it should be even more to the fore. I'll hand that one over to you, Charbel, for comment.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Gary, that COVID-19 is like, the ocean has lowered, and now it's possible to see all the fragilities in our supply chains. And of course, the possibility of disruptions were always there, and the social inequalities, the issue of key workers, So, but for now, I think supply chains are just trying to survive. There is even a new concept, survivability of supply chains, when people are just trying, to make to keep the supply chain alive. So, but after this pandemic is over, we will be, able to think what was missing during COVID and to build up more sustainable supply chains.
Charbel, if I could come back on that one, we talk a lot, not just in academia but in industry, about competing through the supply chain. Do you think we're almost at a survival of the fittest stage with the supply chains at the moment?
Yeah, I think supply chains have suffered from this cost reduction obsession, and at least in the medium time horizon, I think companies will think twice about it.
Yeah.
But in the long run, I totally understand what, and for big companies, I understand what Eligio highlighted, that, there are just companies that in the long run will just do business as usual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Martin, Matthew's come back with an interesting point around your comments. I'll put it on the screen for you so you can see what Martin's saying. I think it's a very valid point about the future of markets going forward with Africa and South America, maybe. Just to round off that discussion of earlier.
Okay, yeah, Matthew's picked on this term that you used earlier with localization, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Can I just read it? Hold on.
Of course.
Well, yeah, I mean, Matthew suggested that we'll just come back to where we were before, and we might learn anything from it. We'll just go back to the global supply chains. I'm not entirely sure about that. I think the earlier point we made about there's definitely going to be a need for localized networks of supply, but they will struggle, because in some ways global supply chains are easier in normal times, if you like. It is easier in some ways to ship product from the far side of the world by a container than it is to often do localized supply. So the only way we're going to change the future forever is improve localized supply networks. So that's better localized infrastructure, maybe different vehicles, maybe using different technologies, maybe communicating better in localized networks. Otherwise, as Matthew suggests, what we might do is just return entirely back and say business as usual. Let's go back for long supply chains. We really need to up our game with localized supply chains, and we can only do that by supporting localized networks and investing in localized networks and providing them with the technology that will help them do that. Maybe David Twigg has got some views on what technology can help to support localized networks and localized supply chains.
Thanks, Martin. David, and any immediate thoughts?
I think that our companies, both large and small, and I think with the point that Eliseo was making earlier about not forgetting the micro and the small and medium-sized firms in our networks, I think technology has an opportunity. The fact that technology is disrupting operations, it is disrupting supply chain optimization. Therefore, if our companies don't have opportunities for both investing in that, but also developing the skill base, we're seeing shifts in our workforce in terms of some activities where technology may have certain advantages. We need to train and reskill certain parts of the population. I think there are opportunities there, but we're also, I would sort of add a word of caution insofar as we have this survivability that's being talked about at the moment. But I then do think that we have a need to really consider what are the different business models moving forward. Alice also earlier referred to some of those in terms of the service sector and considering how to do new forms of distribution for some firms. I think the resilience that we're talking about today will require considerations of workforce, will require considerations of technology within the operation, but also extending outside of how you communicate, and the digital businesses may be one option there. But there's still the need for regional and national government to, of course, ensure that our infrastructure supports what we need to be able to move forward, and to ensure that our international logistics transport systems are capable of coping with these eventualities. One thing I would just add, which I didn't have an opportunity earlier to make, is that I personally don't think that this is a one-off black swan event. There's evidence out of the World Health Organization that other disruptions will take place in the coming years. Therefore, if it's possible for firms to reconsider how to ensure that they have a revised supply and operation network, I think they will be providing themselves with a stronger foothold for the future. And certainly as a university, we can provide some of those insights if companies are interested to talk with us.
Thanks, David. I'm conscious of time, but we've got a rising, dare I say, political agenda here, which I think probably I'm going to throw at Beatrice, if I may. Just some questions around the impact of the political agenda on the future of the supply chain and attitudes towards dependency on the Far East. Beatrice, can you give us a short and succinct thought on that before we bid our colleagues a fond farewell?
Oh, yes, thank you for the question. I think supply chains are in the recovery process right now when we think about the abilities of being able to cope with this disruption. So recovery process is something important. And looking at this perspective, this ability, I think it's time to companies reassess the structure of their supply chains in terms of location, production capacity, and management of flows of materials and information. So it's important to understand what will happen in terms of economic and political actions across the globe in order to reassess the structure of supply chains, where to locate supply chains, and how to organize this flow of materials and information, considering this new period of time and trades. So definitely it's important to pay attention to political tendencies as well, not only look at economic perspectives or consumers' behaviors, but politicians will play, of course, an important role when you think about reassessing and restructure supply chains. I think final thought for the organizations which are in this position in terms of recovering from this disruption from COVID-19 is to be able to learn from this process. It's important to develop knowledge management. It's important to understand how to assess the risk of the supply chain. So it's important to really stop and consider all the facts, learn from the things that have been happening, and of course, try to survive, and more than that, try to really be better than before, considering these disruptions.
Thank you, Beatrice. A nice succinct answer given the time that we've got left on this broadcast. I'm afraid, colleagues, we must bring that to a close now. I want to thank my colleagues within the Lincoln International Business School, but also colleagues from around Lincolnshire and the rest of the world for some of the very interesting discussion that's taken place here. The Resilient interview, Lincolnshire interview series continues every week at the moment. So just before we close the session, can I point you to the next opportunity to be part of this series, which will be with our colleague Francesca tomorrow, when she will look at potential business models beyond the pandemic. So I'm sure that will be a very interesting session. If you have enjoyed what's happened today, please like us on Facebook, LinkedIn or Twitter, and you'll receive regular notifications from us regarding future events. Until then, from the Lincoln International Business School and the Centre for Resilience, can I thank you for your participation? Stay safe and please take care. Thank you very much.